Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film Adventures of Mowgli, or Mowgli. This is actually a 5-episode short series that was then made into a feature film. It's a Russian animated film series. It was made from 1967 to 1971. I'm assuming made once a year just by the fact that that's 5 years and there are 5 parts. But then in 1973, it was released as an entire movie, all cut together. However, I'm reviewing just a collection of the shorts that was on YouTube in their original Russian language. I'm assuming it's from a DVD release that happened in the early 2000s, but I'm not exactly sure, or if the person just had them, because this is actually a fairly popular adaptation in Russian, gets released on whatever home video medium is available almost every decade. Although this film series did start the same year as Disney's The Jungle Book, which was 1967, it really wasn't made, or at least conceived, as a counterpoint to that film, although it definitely plays like that when you watch it now, because most of what we understand, or at least I understand and grew up with understanding about the Jungle Book, is from Disney's movie, not the book, not any other adaptation. It's interesting that this series, which is considered a lot more faithful, I'll take their word for it since I haven't actually read the Jungle Book, but in the original Jungle Book, it is a series of short stories, not always about Mowgli, although there are actual collections just of the Mowgli stories, apparently, from the Jungle Book and the second Jungle Book. So this is kind of a little more faithful, considering that it's just a series of short stories rather than trying to combine it all into one narrative, even though they did that with those stories, but whatever, let's ignore that. But it is darker, it's more surreal, it's stranger, it's really kind of out there, and there's also a continuity to it. I don't know many film short series that have continuity throughout them. I mean, certainly movie serials did, but I've never actually heard of that with animated shorts before, especially at the time. I think that's pretty radical. And so it kind of leads itself to being as one narrative or being a collection, because you really do see an arc throughout all these things, and it is darker and more serious than really the Disney movie, but you kind of have to get past the different adaptation. I think a lot of what this film has to live up to is a very loved Disney classic, but since it's so different, you can really get away from it while you're watching it. It's so different in its animation style. It's so different in pretty much every character in this story is different that I completely forgot about that, and it was on this strange, trippy Jungle Book trip in Russian and got so engrossed in it I almost couldn't get out of it. It was just so interesting and inquisitive, and just such a strange way to do the Jungle Book. It kind of like opens up the imagination of what you can do with animation. When you look at a lot of the stories that both Disney, and this was done by the Russian animation studio Soyuzmultfilm, I think, I can never say their name right. Anytime I've seen at least clips from adaptations that they did versus other animation studios, they always do them in such radically different ways that I almost don't really consider the other adaptation. I look at it really as its own entity, and I think Mowgli, or Adventures of Mowgli, really succeeds in a way that a lot of adaptations don't. You know, obviously they're based on the same source material, so they're staying true to that. Clearly that is not something Disney has ever really been interested in, although they still make entertaining movies. Although this is very faithful in its adaptation, it's still surreal, strange, and completely out there and kind of freeform in its animation that gives you kind of an unforgettable, strange experience. The 5 various episodes in this is Rashka, which is really a story about how they found Mowgli as a little kid, the kidnapping as you see him get slightly older and he's kidnapped by a bunch of monkeys, and Baloo and Bagheera rescue him from their clutches. Then Akila's Last Hunt, where Mowgli finds an iron tooth, or as we call them, like knives, and Akila's Last Hunt is really about how his father, one of the wolves that raises Mowgli, who have a much bigger role in this version than I've ever seen before, misses a hunt and is brought into question whether he should still be leading the hunt or it should be his last hunt. Then the fight when this large pack is coming to attack the jungle, and it's really just a big fight episode. And then Return to Mankind is half about Mowgli defeating Shere Khan, and the other half having kind of an existential crisis about returning to mankind. As you see him get older, like see him start taking over the wolf pack, and particularly in the end where he's the head of the wolf pack, it's interesting how dark and strange this one can really get, particularly the character of Bagheera, who is actually female in this version. Apparently a lot of that comes from the fact that Bagheera's name ends in an A, and in Russian, if a character's name ends in an A, they're usually a woman. My wife actually found that out, which I thought was really interesting, that instead of going like, oh, well, obviously it's a man if you read like the story, but just because of that one little letter, it's apparently based on certain countries in their adaptations of the Jungle Book. Sometimes Bagheera is a woman because that's how they differentiate gender, I guess, which is really kind of odd to me, but I actually really love the character of Bagheera in this version, not only because my Bagheera in my household, Olive, is also a girl, but also because the way Bagheera moves in this cartoon is really interesting and free-flowing and weird and strange and moving around, and it almost feels like almost nothing has weight to it, which gives it this really surreal quality. The animation in this just is so out there and avant-garde, and I'd heard that about Russian animation after a certain point, particularly in the 60s. It's almost like you wouldn't think like drugs and 60s culture would have made it over to the U.S.S.R. at this point in time, but if you watch any of their animation, you're like, holy shit, you guys were trippier than the Yellow Submarine. It can be dark, it can have a very serious tone to it, but it's just very out there, and particularly Bagheera, when Bagheera would move around and moves like a snake almost, just kind of sways around, and just the free-formness of it is just really kind of odd. Anytime Bagheera was on screen, I like had to pay attention, not just because Bagheera was female, just because I loved to watch Bagheera move. It was just such an amazing fluid experience. Baloo is much more of an older kind of statesman advisor. It's not really like the fun Baloo, you know, the bare necessities Baloo. It's more like just like this dude who chills out and like gives Mowgli advice sometimes, and Mowgli's much more of a serious, confident character in this than I'd ever seen Mowgli be before. Everybody moved in strange ways, but Kaa the python in this doesn't hypnotize people with his eyes, and he's kind of like an older snake advisor and friend to Mowgli a lot, but Kaa would like hypnotize people with the movements of his like kind of snake body and do all these weird movements that are strange and odd. You really have to see it to believe it. I will have a link to the version I saw it, and I recommend that. They made an American version called The Adventures of Mowgli, and one of the things they really didn't get about it was apparently they added a song, which there's no songs in this. I don't know how they added a song, but apparently they added a song. There's a lot of moments where you're just watching the animation do all this strange stuff. You're watching these interesting character designs and this fluid movement and this strange movement and these interesting backgrounds and everything go on. You just hear this strange kind of jazzy score, and I thought that was really cool. The score is that kind of like 60s kind of laid back kind of jazz vibe, which is weird, but I was all for it, with all these like silent parts where you're just kind of just taking in from the visuals what they're telling you. Sometimes they're not really telling you anything, they're just having cool and weird animation, but when they dubbed it and recut it for The Adventures of Mowgli in the 90s, they had Charlton Heston give narration, and they kind of normaled it up as much as you can, which you can't really, but they color corrected the shit out of it and made it look real ugly. Kudos to America for being total dicks and ruining a good piece of art. I think what they missed about it is the uniqueness about this film is its adaptation and its idea of taking a story like this. I mean, certainly you are going to place this, and as I was watching it, I was kind of placing this as a counter to Disney's Jungle Book, but it plays in such a left field way that its adaptation kind of gives it life that you're not thinking about it. And I think it says a lot about adaptation and how we adapt stories, that they were smart enough to adapt it in this way. Now, maybe what probably helped is Disney's Jungle Book is such a crazy adaptation that it leaves out a lot of stuff and changes a lot of stuff and is very different. That certainly helps. I mean, if they were both faithful, I don't think it would be as interesting and different, and the Disney one probably would reign supreme, although it already does. Because that adaptation is so different, this one could be more faithful and stylistically different, and it's going to work really well. And I think if your two studios are adapting the same thing, you really have to do it in a way that's so far removed that you're not similar at all. When I was looking at the various cinematic Jungle Books, this seemed to be the most interesting to me because it seemed to be so fucking different, and it really is. It's probably one of the most surreal adaptations I've seen of something, while also being faithful, but somehow putting on levels of surrealism that I don't think the book or Kipling ever intended. The director of this, Roman Davydov, I think, or Davydov, did a really amazing amazing job. It makes me want to see more of his work because it was like stepping into a world I've never stepped into. I've seen other Russian animation before, but watching this, they had such a weird, kind of interesting, odd quality to them. It's just like nothing I'd ever seen before. And seeing like a story I kind of knew just taken in such a different direction was really, really fun. As a viewer, I really recommend this to fans of animation or just fans of the Jungle Book, because I think you'd be like, what a long, strange trip I just went on. And it's not actually very long. It's only about 90 some minutes, but I do highly recommend the Russian version, and I actually recommend watching the shorts. I technically didn't watch Mowgli. I guess I watched Adventures of Mowgli, but I did watch everything that probably was in it anyway, so you could say I watched that too. I think Russian animation can be interesting and strange and different. The earlier stuff isn't as strange as this. I think this is a stranger period for Russian animation. I'm not exactly sure why. I love this Jungle Book because I love just understanding like how Mowgli has to wrestle with returning to mankind and isn't sure about that. And certainly at that time in the story, he's the head of the pack. Like, why would he want to leave? I mean, why would you want to leave when you've like conquered this world? But that he's having like a crisis about it, and the way they animate it in such a strange way. It's not just like he's running and crying. Like, they make these streaks while he's running, and they like change the backgrounds. They really illustrate what's going on emotionally with him, and you're almost not sure how to take it. The final episode of this, or final cartoon or story, is one of the more interesting ones because he like defeats Shere Khan. It's almost like he can live in the jungle peacefully with all these animals and have a great life, but then the story just becomes something else, and this existential crisis about whether he should return to man or not, because he sees this girl and she's super cute and stuff. It's very interesting, the ideas that it tackles, the way it tackles those stories. I think one of the reasons you try to see foreign animation is because there's not enough known. I couldn't really find out if Disney's Jungle Book was released in Russia at this time or not. I got the impression it's fairly beloved since it gets released on home video every now and then, but I don't know this world very well, and it got me very interested. It got me to want to recommend this to people who like trippy, strange animation, but also people who like animation in general, because it's a fine example of how you can adapt something and make it strange, wonderful, and beautiful, and completely separate from another thing that's being adapted by the same thing at the same time. As much as you want to argue this wasn't made as a counterpoint to Disney's The Jungle Book, it definitely helps the film and its reputation. Now, I'm not going to use that to bash Disney's Jungle Book. I think they're both really great movies, but the way it does everything and the way you see this fluid animation with these strange character designs, or they feel strange, but going into foreign animation, I think it's wonderful stepping into a whole new world of whole different rules and whole different expectations and whole different ways of doing things. And this reminds me of early animation in America, where things were trippier and stranger, and by the time you got to the 60s, certainly you had trippier, stranger animation, but you didn't have them really from a major studio, unless you're counting Ralph Bakshi, who I don't, it was kind of a major studio, but that wouldn't happen at least yet. They were kind of a little more normal, at least in terms of features. You had UPA and things, but you didn't have things this strange. And that's what I really love about this movie, is its strange way of animating it, but almost like the script wasn't strange. It's like how they did it really more than what was on the page. A lot of that credit goes to the direction and the animators on this, because I think they really brought out a quality to it that only you can do with really interesting and odd and beautiful animation. It probably says a lot about what animation can do to a script and how they can bring it out and change it in different ways that live action could never imagine. I haven't seen every cinematic version of The Jungle Book, but this is definitely one worth checking out, because it'll take you in such a weird, odd direction and kind of push you in a weird, strange version of Russian animation that just feels slightly off and offbeat, but very much alive and beautiful and fluid. And watching the flow of this animation is pretty much like nothing I'd seen before. It's something I keep thinking about, and it's a very memorable, beautiful, strange animation experience that only Russia could give us and throw us down such a beautiful adventure that you'll never soon forget. So if you have seen Adventures of Mowgli and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.